Welcome to the LawyerFair.co.uk daily podcast. LawyerFair helps businesses find the right lawyer at the fairest price. But on this podcast, we just chew the fat with some great guests.
So here we are again. It seems barely a day since we did our last daily podcast, which I suppose follows. But here we are, LawyerFair Daily Podcast. Andrew Weaver, CEO of LawyerFair.co.uk. And today we're going to discuss an issue that is absolutely, probably high up, if not number one, on many business owners and entrepreneurs' list. And that's hiring, the hiring process, how you get hiring right, and also, frankly, sometimes how when you have hired someone, you maybe have to deal with losing them again. And I make that rather brutal call based on a book actually I'm reading at the moment, which is called The Hard Thing About Hard Things. It's written by Ben Horowitz. And if you are interested, he's a kind of Anderson Horowitz VC guy over in Silicon Valley. If you are interested in how a startup or a very fast growth startup goes and the challenges faced, it's a really great book. But one of the key chapters is about the need to clearly hire well, but also act quickly if that hire hasn't worked. So, enough of my intro. My guest is hanging on here and having to listen to all of this, but welcome Jas Singh, Managing Director of Iopa Solutions.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for making no noises behind that 1 minute introduction, Jas. But you are, I mean, your company specialises in recruitment, so there can be no better person to speak about this issue. And clearly, it is an absolutely critical area for companies to get right.
Absolutely. I mean, hiring is pretty much, as you said, along with funding. If you look at all the stats, it's pretty much the two areas that most businesses fail on, right? A, getting the capital to get going in the first place, and then to get the right people to make sure that you keep going. So I couldn't agree with you more.
Well, so let's drill into this a little, Jas. I mean, what do you think are the biggest challenges? It's a very competitive market. So, what is the best way, or what are the biggest mistakes people make when they're recruiting, and how can they improve their recruiting process?
Yeah, it's a great question, Andrew. So first and foremost, in a nutshell, the crux of the matter is that a lot of people, when they go about the hiring process, they've had no training in it. And you're a business owner, and as any business owner or any MBA will tell you, or any entrepreneur will tell you, any aspect of the business process can be accelerated and you can minimize the mistakes just by getting some training. So whether that's raising finance, or whether that's kind of getting your cost procedures right, getting your operational procedures right. And the same thing applies exactly to hiring as well. So unfortunately, because it's kind of what a lot of people call a softer skill, a gut-based decision type skill, a lot of people just don't have the training on hiring. So it's generally based on opinions, biases, that kind of thing. And because of that, often they're kind of going round and round in circles, and they don't really know exactly what's the kind of best practices for that.
Well, I mean, that's really goes to the crux of the matter, I think, because most people do hire. I mean, clearly you have a set criteria, but when you're starting a business, you often hire on gut instinct. It's not always the perfect candidate. It's not always the guy or the girl that has exactly the right criteria. So, and there's a guy that I know who's run a number of businesses, and he has a saying for this, Jas. He says, you don't actually know with new recruits anything about them until you've run them, until they're in there, and then you have to work. So how do you improve that instinct? Where does coaching play a part in getting that instinct sharpened?
It's a great question. So I could kind of I could go on and on about this, but essentially, it all comes down to getting the hiring process right from the start. Okay, so a good reference point would be, so a few years ago, Google, obviously everybody knows Google, they did a really, really big study called Project Oxygen. And basically what they did in true Google fashion, they went out there and they crunched all the numbers on all the hires that they ever made and how these guys perform. So as you can imagine, Google has kind of every dashboard on interview processes, when people were doing online kind of profiles, and also post-hiring as well. So, once these guys are on board, they kind of measure every single type of aspect in both performance, but also kind of, contributing to the culture, how the team performed, that kind of thing. And bizarrely, what they found after crunching all these algorithms is that all hiring was at best random. Okay, so I think the number they got was like 53% success, right? So if you look at 50-50 kind of being a chance, they're kind of 3% better. And that study was picked up by Harvard Business School, and they kind of carried on and did a few follow-on studies as well. And they found that generally speaking, most companies were kind of between 50 and 60% in terms of hiring success. So I suppose the reason why it's not been changed for so long has been because it's kind of slightly above average. So if you carry on going and as you said, get rid of people quickly enough, over time you will hire the right people, and a certain amount will stick. But as any business process, right, 50 to 60% isn't good enough. So they kind of looked and they went into it in terms of more detail, and we've kind of taken that internally and kind of simplified it a bit. And basically what we found is that there's 4 components to a successful hiring process, right? And the first one starts off with you really, really have to define the performance goals. So what we mean by that is, if you look at most interview processes, you kind of have an idea of what the candidate is expected to achieve. So a sales guy, it could be a sales target. For a marketing guy, it could be a kind of number of leads that you're going to bring in. For a reporter, it could be a number of articles that they be expected to produce, for example, and perhaps something around quality. But you kind of discuss that for a couple of minutes, and then the rest of the process, the rest of the interview process is to do with, it's a bit of a cat and mouse thing. And what these studies and all the follow-on studies and a lot of our research has proved as well is that if you consistently define the performance goals, so what these guys are expected to achieve at, say, for example, 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months, and more importantly, consistently emphasize that during the interview process, so perhaps 2 to 3 times every single interview question, then what's going to happen is twofold. Number one, you're more likely to focus on exactly what you want and be less biased. And more importantly, I suppose, they also found is that by emphasizing the same thing over and over again, people who weren't 100% confident that they could deliver that kind of fell away, right? So, if you're a sales guy and you're not sure you can deliver the quota, you can kind of hear it once and say, okay, fine. But if you're, as an interviewer, consistently emphasizing that, it's kind of like at school, right? The reason why a lot of schools and universities are outperforming now is people know exactly, they look at the syllabus and they know exactly what they need to achieve, and then as they're going into the exams, they're fully prepared on that. So it's kind of taking that a step further and making sure that these performance goals are really defined at the start.
Mm-hmm. Well, that makes sense. Although most sales guys I've met are so full of their own chutzpah that they generally say yes to most targets.
which is a great. So that's why it's a 4-step process, right?
I got it. So number 2, Jas.
Yeah, so number 2 would be defining the job, right? So again, what all these studies prove is that most job specs, if you look at most job specs and what they entail, usually it's like a candidate type description. So it'll say, we want someone with a degree, someone with 5 to 7 years of experience, somebody who's got experience in, for example, in your case, a particular sector of law. And as I'm sure you've found, Andrew, over the years, and most entrepreneurs and hiring managers have found, is that people can be successful in different ways, right? So we've all hired people who weren't nothing like what we looked like on the candidate description, but just seemed to work. Mm-hmm. And so, the second component of the hiring process is, rather than focus on trying to describe a personality which is so complex, it's better to define the job. So what exactly is that candidate what was that candidate must be able to do in order to be successful, right? So a list of activities that this candidate would be expected to complete or be able to do as part of the role. And again, if you look at most job specs, very few are actually focused on that. It's more on the candidate part. So that's the second most important part, because again, by emphasizing that through the process, you can kind of speak to people and say, well, will this person be, do you think this person can make 50 cold calls a day, or do you think this person will be able to kind of put together a comprehensive marketing strategy?
Yep. No, it makes perfect sense.
Mm-hmm. And so the third one is the employee value proposition, right? So again, what a lot of employers are finding now in today's market, and it's kind of harking back to the pre-crisis days, is that even if you do find candidates, as you rightfully mentioned at the top of this interview, they kind of go quite quickly, right? They get attracted by their opportunities, by their roles, or even stay where they are. And so employers really need to develop what's the value proposition for them. If a candidate is going to come and join you, what is the single most important reason that they're going to come? It's, again, like most branding, it has to be quite specific. So if you're a startup, it's a chance to perhaps work in a dynamic, entrepreneurial, flexible environment. If you're a big brand, it's a chance to perhaps be associated with a big brand and have a good brand on your CV, that kind of thing. And again, if you look at most interview processes, that's not really defined. It's something that's maybe left right at the end when they're trying to close the candidate that they want, but it's really something that needs to be integrated into the entire hiring process from the start.
Yeah, I've got quite a funny little anecdote story on that, actually. There's a guy I know who runs quite a successful business, and he was chatting to me the other day about how he finds hiring quite difficult. And he said, he said, this is a quote, he said, "I don't understand you, Andrew. Every year I look through the Sunday Times best companies to work for, I steal all the best ideas and then put them into these packages." But I think what he kind of misunderstood was the kind of ethos of his business wasn't, as attractive as he thought it was. So all these little perks were quite nice, but actually, people join companies because they represent something.
Well, it was exactly. I couldn't agree with you more. And there was that kind of study again. I can't remember off the top of my head which journal did it, but there was that study a few years back. It's going back some time, about why people wanted to work at Facebook and why they wanted to work at Google. And we actually crunched it and kind of had a list of why people wanted to work there when they went to Stanford and all the kind of pre-grad or postgraduate universities. They actually found that because the two words that came up most often, or 2 points that came up most often rather, were because they provided smoothies and you could wear a hoodie to work. And again, it's ridiculous and bizarre, but it's amazing how some of these things keep coming up over and over again.
No, it is amazing what attracts people. No, that's great. Okay, and number 4?
And first and foremost, fourth is the assessment process, right? So currently, most traditional interviews, they're kind of based on kind of loose question and answer type exchanges. They can be quite unstructured. So, you kind of come in, how's your day? There's not an actual structured process for interviewing. And the problem with that is that twofold. Number one, you get a lot more biases. So if you meet a candidate and they happen to immediately strike up some rapport, that's great. Obviously, it's important in certain types of role, but that can influence your thinking on that candidate. And secondly, it doesn't really allow you to compare. So unless you're asking the same questions to the same candidates in the same order, it's going to be quite difficult to compare the different candidates. And again, all the studies have shown that people who look at something that's known as structured behavioral interviews, which is basically asking very specific questions about how candidates have acted or behaved in the past, those types of processes are incredibly more effective.
Well, listen, that really is amazing. I'm blown away by the level of detail you've gone into there. And we only give people 10 or 12 minutes on these daily podcasts. So I think probably when we transcribe this, there'll probably be more words in what you've said than any of our previous 50-odd chats. So that's fantastic. I'm going to ask you a final question here.
Sure.
Is there a kind of killer question? Is there an effective question you found in your experience, or type of question that has been really, really effective? That may be impossible to answer.
No, it's a great question, and I do have an answer for that, although it's actually not one question, it's two questions.
Okay.
Right, and again, for me, over the years, I've kind of found it tells you a lot more because it kind of goes quite deep. So the single question that I usually like to start off with is, when I've got a candidate in an interview, so I'm interviewing on behalf of a client or just generally to kind of profile them, is what is your single biggest achievement in your career to date? That really, really makes, with that answer, not only does it kind of show you what people perceive to be their biggest success, but also it's something that really gets people thinking, and really kind of, you see them, the levels of enthusiasm go to the highest possible thing because they realize they've kind of got one go at kind of really selling themselves. So that would be the biggest one. And then I usually follow it up with, well, how did you go about achieving that? So then kind of getting a breakdown of, this is your biggest achievement, but what were the steps that you took? Why is it such a big achievement? You kind of get an understanding of how people break things down, how they problem solve, and how they behave, which can be a good indicator of how they might be able to perform in the future.
Yeah, well, that's awesome, and that's an awesome response. Now, I'm going to wrap this up by telling people that Jas's LinkedIn page is probably one of the most active I've ever seen. It's something like 11,000 followers and over 200 posts. Where do you find the time to write all these things?
But it's bizarrely enough, so it's a great question, Andrew. I get asked this a lot. So bizarrely enough, it's actually something that I do in my, in inverted commas, spare time, right? So I've kind of had a bit of a passion for writing. In my career, I've not really had a chance to kind of apply it, I suppose. As, growing up, I wanted to be the next Roald Dahl, right? So but I have two small children, and so 6 o'clock in the morning, 6 to 7 is daddy and kiddie time, right? So I kind of have them on the breakfast table, I have my Mac out, and that's when I kind of try to get one out within kind of 45 minutes or so. So I'd love to say that I kind of do it on on a scenic route into work or in a tree house somewhere, but it's much less glamorous than that.
Well, whatever you're doing, mate, it's very impressive. So Jas Singh, if you go on LinkedIn, increase your hiring power. Not difficult to find, Jas, with so many followers and posts. And the company is Iopa Solutions, IOPA Solutions. But we always put these links with these podcasts anyway. Jas, thanks so much. You've been an absolute star.
Absolute pleasure with me as well, Andrew. All the best.
Great information. And that was the LawyerFair Daily Podcast. There will be more tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to the LawyerFair.co.uk daily podcast. If you'd like to listen to more, why not subscribe and download each episode via iTunes or visit us on the LawyerFair.co.uk website.